welcome to my YouTube channel about art and design. Today we are at Charles Trevelyan's studio. Hello Charles, how are you?
I'm good, thanks.
So we will do an interview and he will tell us about his work and what he does, his practice in his studio. So hello Charles, can we get to know you a little bit about your background, how you decided to become an artist?
Sure. I'm originally from Australia, but I live and work in London now and have done for quite some time. Getting to the point at which I am now, i.e. working somewhere in between design and art, is a fairly convoluted process and not one that I necessarily undertook knowing where I would end up. My background is more engineering science, material science, physics, chemistry, but I knew that I wanted to end up working somewhere where there's substantial creative element to what I did. And in terms of where I grew up and studied, there weren't really very many options to do that. And so part of moving to London was to look to find an outlet for the creative side of what I do. Although I expected to end up in a position and a career which more combined the two, whereas where I find myself now, while I still find the material science and those technical elements be very useful to what I do, most of what I do would be considered sort of wholly creative.
Would you tell us about your studio practice? Do you make all your work here, or do you go to other workshops to produce your work?
I do a lot of making in the studio. Making is an integral part of what I do, both in terms of idea development and also in terms of production. But I don't make the finished pieces because the majority of my work tends to be cast in bronze or machined in stone, so utilising machinery and skills which I don't have here. That said, because when you cast from bronze you need a full-scale version to make the moulds from, I do make, in that I make a one-to-one replica of the final piece, and so that's what I tend to do in the studio. And to do that I use a range of processes, increasingly digital processes, but I still do use a lot of kind of hand work, kind of working with materials, experimenting, testing finishes, and fundamentally to create the textures which you see on the surface of the cast pieces.
So in the studio most of these materials and supplies are all for making these handmade prototypes and tests?
Prototypes, tests, and also I find that when I present ideas to clients, that a physical object is far better at conveying what I want to convey at that point of the process. And therefore, rather than use drawings and renders, except where necessary, I tend to hand make a lot of models. And so a lot of the time I spend here, the making, in fact probably the majority of the making that I do, with the exception of bigger projects, is on making small kind of presentation models to show clients.
How do you start a new project and what are your inspirations?
I think there are kind of two distinct directions in that regard, and probably one is more interested than the other. Clearly, when you have a client that comes to you with a specific project brief, then the initiation is based wholly around what the client has asked you to do. However, a lot of my work is more self-driven, and I think that's the more interesting side of things, because that's where I get to think more about how I go about the process. And it's something which I've thought about a lot in recent years, because I think it's the way a project starts is really critical to how you finish, to where you end up. My feeling was that all of us tend to have tend to be predisposed to a certain way of working, certain styles, certain aesthetic preferences. And if you simply start designing or start making, inevitably you follow the pathways which you're used to following, and therefore that tends to channel the work in a similar direction to where you've been before. And so several years ago I started experimenting with ways of initiating projects myself, which forced me to consider different options or to work with different materials or process or forms, start with something which is completely different to what I would normally work with, and therefore shape the process from the beginning in a way which meant that I was working differently to how I would if I was just doing it instinctively. Now inevitably there's a certain element of it's still me working on that project, and therefore the way I develop the project does tend to steer it back into something that would be recognisable in my style. But I think that by kind of using these initial precursors, it may be shapes, it may be a process or something I've never tried before, at least steers or gives a different starting point, and hopefully is evident in the final product piece.
And what are the research and development processes you use in your work?
I do use a number. I think probably the key area is development of ways of production is one, because I think, even though I'm not making final pieces, the production of the prototypes and the one-to-one scale models is a significant element of my time. So developing processes which facilitate that and enable me, as someone who works on their own, to work on larger scale pieces effectively and efficiently is one. The other is looking into how I can obtain different forms and textures in the one-to-one pieces that are cast. So experimenting with materials a lot, with things like the viscosity of the mediums that I use, or the makeup of the mediums that change the drying time or the final textures, and therefore influence the sort of surface aesthetic of the pieces I'm working on. And
do you do any academic or reading related research, or is it mostly hands-on, very practice?
It's mostly hands-on. I find I'm developing my own techniques more, and I think that's in part because in terms of my academic experience, it's physics, chemistry, mathematics, and so on. And so my it's not really relevant in an academic sense. And I think furthermore, the way I work tends to be quite intuitive and based on making, and so I don't really ever draw a particular link between reading, writing, and written material, either mine or someone else's, and the way in which I work.
What is good design in your opinion?
Big question. I think, first of all, design is such a broad area. Design is fundamentally any creative process that results in something new, whether that be an object or a process or it can be incredibly broad. And even though when you say design, to most people they think an object is the finished product, it really is more about the process of getting from A to B than what you end up at. That said, I think in terms of what we're talking about, it's probably more relevant to talk about design as in design of an object, and specifically the kind of things that I work in. And in that regard, design, I think, is often then defined by some sort of brief. I think if you're talking about kind of open-ended creativity, you're talking more about fine arts, and that is part of my process, but generally it's a brief. And so coming back to your question, good design is one which fulfills the brief in a way which is rational, economic, aesthetically fulfilling, and perhaps really importantly now is responsible. So in terms of environmental considerations, in terms of all the aspects which I think really make up a good design. Good design is not purely about creating something that looks beautiful or functions well, even though those are integral aspects. I think it's about making sure that what you design has a sense of purpose and is done so in a responsible way, both in the way which the piece is created and manufactured, but also in terms of the implications of the use of that design.
What were the key moments, challenges you have experienced in your career? How do you overcome them?
I think for me, the key moment was realizing that I wanted to make a transition fully from the more technical kind of background, my sciences, to creative kind of career, and trying to figure out how to make that happen. I arrived in London, and it's a London city full of opportunities, but it's also a city full of people looking for those opportunities. And I think it took me quite some time to figure out a way in, if that's the way to put it. It's the barriers are quite high, and not having any links, connections, any understanding of the process of the way you get into this industry was a real challenge. For some time, I kind of weighed up how to do it, and then it was simply the realization that it's not going to happen until you actually make something happen. And so I created some works, found an organization that would exhibit them, and I think everything stemmed from that. So that was sort of one of the key challenges. Possibly too was then moving from more production-led design into the design art, kind of more sculptural end of things. Again, going from an area which I was quite comfortable in to one which I really was not familiar with, and figuring out how to develop a style of work suitable for a completely new area, new market. And in that regard, I think it came down to simply trusting your instincts. I mean, it's very easy to try to second guess every aspect and to be thinking everything through, and I think that's important. But there is a point at which you just simply have to trust your skills and make the best of it. And it may go well, it may not, but trying to over-evaluate a situation can lead to more problems than it solves.
What would you recommend to people who aspire to become an artist or a designer?
I think there's two key things, and one that I think is really important is that to really be successful and also to be fulfilled and happy about what you do, I think it's really essential to develop a strong sense of self-purpose and style would be the wrong word. It's not necessarily developing something which is sort of instinctively, stylistically yours, but a recognizable direction, something that people can cotton onto and creates a sort of story about the work. I think the danger there is stereotyping, and I don't mean establishing something which means that you get known for one thing and one thing only, but more having a sort of, I think it's more something which is for yourself rather than external, something which you know is a sustaining direction and something which is of interest, and so therefore you can continue to evaluate and develop. And in part that leads on to the second aspect, which I think is really critical. There's a real tendency when you as a designer or an artist come up with something you feel is incredibly strong to latch onto that and to push it for all it's worth. Sometimes that can be successful, and sometimes for a wide range of reasons, even the best ideas just never go anywhere. And it can become a real problem to become fixated on this one thing in the belief that that will be massively successful. I think the more time you spend on something, there are diminishing returns, and your time is almost always better spent working on new ideas. Put something to the side, you can come back to it, but getting stuck in this sort of position whereby you're so focused on this one brilliant idea that you exclude any other options, I think is a real trap that's easy to fall into.
What do you look forward to in the near future, and what has been recently happening in your studio practice?
I think the key thing I'm looking forward to is some new work which has been, for various reasons, including pandemic, delayed, but that should be going into production this year and hopefully finished maybe later this year or early next year. And it's a collection I've invested a lot of time in and I'm really keen to see produced. And summer holidays, I'm really looking forward to getting away in the summer.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles, for inviting us to your studio and taking the time to do this interview. It's been a pleasure. So Charles's work you can visit on his website. I will put the link below, and you can also follow this channel in English and Turkish language about art and design. And thank you, Charles, and we look forward to the new work that's coming soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.